country to another. Along this network of treaties, you can have a base in France, and France has a tax treaty with the Netherlands have tax treaties with everybody. So you can move your profit from, Ireland to Bermuda and back. The key about this, I suppose, is that the company is kind of sitting there in the middle, and the company can see where its profits are going. An individual country is sitting there at the junction of some of those webs, so they can see what money is coming in and what money is going out, but they don't get to see the overall structure. So it's very difficult for a taxing authority at some kind of junction here to see what's actually going on. They can see, okay, you've got XYZ PLC has a base in Ireland, and they have a transaction with their sister company in South Africa. I don't really know what that's about. I can't really tell whether that's reasonable. What you need to make that more reasonable is a kind of a free exchange of information between our tax authority and the South African tax authority. There isn't that kind of automatic information exchange between taxing authorities yet. It's an increasing trend. There's more exchange, but it's not yet automatic. It makes it very difficult for countries to put the appropriate level of tax on global companies that are operating within their borders. And that's even more difficult if it's a developing country where their taxing authority is fairly under-resourced to begin with. This is what's sometimes called the global tax consensus. So you've got fairly low rates, you've got a good network of tax treaties and transfer pricing. But I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. It's just one example of how the power can be used. And that kind of thing with common needs and structures, because your company goes into one country and you kind of negotiate a deal along those lines, and then Andy's company goes into another country and negotiates a deal along those lines. There's a tide of legislation in a range of different countries which suits common interests, and that gives the corporations again more power, so it's kind of a self-fulfilling thing. So what are the outcomes of this? Well, you have this kind of outsourced social contract. So the government has a social contract with the people in any given country to provide for their needs or whatever. This gets outsourced a little through means of, say, privatisation and offshoring to corporations. So you have more and more things being privatised. If you look at the IMF Memorandum of Understanding, you can see that there's quite a lot of issues that a lot of services that they would like to have privatised. If you look at the UK, you can see that the train services are privatised, some prison services are privatised in the US. A lot of things that we regard as the job of the state become more privatised. With privatisation, you get offshoring. So the offshoring of services. Now, again, offshoring of services in itself might not be, in theory, a problem, but you normally have a power imbalance there as well, because services are offshored to where costs are low, and there is a severe risk of exploiting people in those particular jurisdictions. You have a kind of an ideology that comes into government with which all of us are fairly familiar. People talk about the economy as shorthand for the country. You talk about the fact that you need to set up your financial structures in a way that you maintain the line on the graph, and you can kind of ignore the impact on people, because you can say, well, if you start working towards people, then your line on your graph is going to go off, and this doesn't make any sense. You get that kind of ideology going on, and the people's voices tend to be muted. Now, this image came. It's obviously based in the global south. You get this kind of vicious circle when countries become very dependent on global multinationals. You have kind of cheap labour. It lowers the standards in terms of regulation generally, environmental regulation, labour regulation. And you have cut price services, so you have reduced services to people, and people are to be, aren't you lucky to have a job kind of mentality. You also have increasingly a big issue around land, especially land in Africa. In 2008, the South Korean company Daewoo made a deal with the government of Madagascar to buy or lease, on a 99-year lease, half the country. Like half the land of Madagascar, which is insane. Now, luckily that particular deal fell through, but as it was reported in Time magazine, they're saying this is pretty good for the government of Madagascar, because you had a lot of impoverished people, and like Andy said, they had no big development plan. They would come in, they would use the land to grow biofuels or whatever. Obviously, small matter of half the population being kicked off the land. But Time magazine reported it enthusiastically by saying that this is very good for the people of Madagascar because they will be building infrastructure and ports. There'll be a lot of construction work for a couple of years and people will be able to work and they'll have enough money to buy their own food, even if it is imported. This idea of forget about the long-term sustainability, there's going to be a bit of construction in the short-term, lads, and that'll provide employment. That's a familiar rhetoric that we've heard recently, not too far from home. So there's a serious land grab going on now, and it's mostly corporations who are buying land in South Africa, and it's the familiar kind of tenant farmer thing. And will come, and that feeds into the power of the companies again. So solutions are very difficult because the thing is embedded. You need some kind of regulation, obviously, to kind of curb the power of companies. Now, who is going to regulate? Individual countries can't. They don't have enough power to regulate. You need, OECD could produce some regulation, but it's difficult. There's that quote, it's difficult to get somebody to understand something when their job depends on not understanding it. So it can be difficult to change policy in those kind of bodies. The UN are doing quite a bit in the area of tax treaties, for example, which is my own area. They're doing very good work. The UN are very under-resourced. They are doing very good work in the area, though it's slow, obviously, but they're doing good stuff. You could argue that regulation might come from transparency, and I think that's probably the easiest way for it to happen, through people being better informed and through people in power. That kind of transparency would also help to regulate governments, because you could argue there should also be some kind of a stop on people like the government of Madagascar to stop them from selling half the country to Daewoo. Another thing that would make the government a little less inclined to do that is obviously the issue of debt. If a country is so crippled with sovereign debt that they have no way of providing for people, then they are much more vulnerable to being sort of pushed around in those areas. A focus on smaller enterprise would be very helpful. So focusing the economic development argument on, smaller companies, on things that are less global, like tourism, those kind of things. And I'm not talking about some kind of rosy-tinted, let's all go back to John Hine postcards or anything like that. But there are industries and there are sectors which are less prone to this kind of thing, things that are rooted in the country. And all in all, it obviously requires a policy shift. This picture's from Kenya a couple of years ago, and she says FDIs, meaning foreign direct investment, FDIs are not a solution to sustainable development. And I think that more or less sums up the kind of relationship between companies and countries. Thank you.
So our last speaker now this morning is Mick O'Reilly, who's president of the Dublin Council of Trade Unions and former regional secretary of Unite. And the topic that Mick is going to focus on is the future of Europe, and that includes the whole of Europe, not just the EU, which seems to have more or less monopolised the term Europe. So, Mick.
Well, I am not. Anybody who thinks that I'm going to talk about what I was asked to talk about, or conform and do what I was told, has come to the wrong meeting, or doesn't know me. I want to start, if I can, with a poem written to deal with a very different situation in Europe. It was written by Bertolt Brecht, but I think it completely sums up where we are. And the first two speakers talked about the lack of answers, that they're not providing an answer. But I think to pose the question is to begin, and to think of alternatives is the way to begin it. But the poem is by Brecht, and it's called The Waverer. And he says, "You tell us it looks bad for our cause. The darkness gets deeper. Our powers get feebler. Now, after all we have worked for so many years, we are in a more difficult position than at the start. But the enemy stands there, stronger than ever before. His powers appear to have grown. Indeed, he has taken on an aspect of invincibility. We, however, have made mistakes. There is no denying it. Our numbers are dwindling. Our slogans are in disarray. The enemy has twisted our words beyond recognition. But what now is false of what we said? Some of it, all of it. Who can we still count on? Or are we just leftovers, thrown out of the living stream? Shall we remain behind, understood by no one and understood by none? Or have we just got to get lucky? This, you ask, expect no answers other than your own. That's the period, I think, of history that we're in. We have to provide answers that are not. Nobody else has been where we are now before. We are in a new place. So, to begin to look for answers, and when you talk about Europe, I think you have to go to the origins of what gave rise to the European Union as we have it today and the circumstances that we have it today. Because all institutions and all individuals bear the hallmarks of their origins. So to find an answer to what this is about, I think you have to go to the beginning. And to the beginning of the European project, you have to understand it was a very different Europe. It consisted of, I suppose, 5 broken empires as a result of the Second World War. Smashed. The 2 big and important powers on the European continent were the Soviet Union and America. Britain, although it was not defeated by fascism, was greatly weakened and was not a strong power, was not able to influence events. And so, in these set of circumstances, there was a debate as to what kind of Europe there would be. And in that debate, there were 2 economists involved in it, Hayek and John Maynard Keynes. And the argument that won out was what they describe as embedded liberalism. It's very interesting that the Americans pushed this argument, because embedded liberalism simply meant that you would take the institutions of Europe and put what used to be the argument about politics, in other words, the argument about how much taxation you might have, the degree of nationalisation you might have, and all of those things, those kind of democratic politics, the things that are not set in stone, but decided by people, and different parties and governments have different approach to them. You would move beyond that, and you would institutionalise permanent competition in the very Treaty of Rome itself. And when the Americans developed the Marshall Plan, there were communist and left-wing governments right throughout Europe. And the conditions to get Marshall aid was that you would balance your books, abandon price control, abandon nationalisation, and of course all these conditions meant that the coalition governments in Europe collapsed. The communists were thrown out of the governments in France, in Italy, in Denmark, and the left was generally thrown out of these governments. Having defeated fascism on the European continent, they were all thrown out. So this European Union that was formed was not, as people think, a European peace project. It was designed, in my opinion, to stabilise capitalism, to stop the advances of socialism, and to institutionalise permanently, beyond democratic debate, capitalism, and to stop any challenges to it. Now, I'll just give an interesting contrast, because the Americans were deeply involved in this, and they used various people. But it is interesting that if you wanted to stand in the United States of America for the presidency, and you wanted to stand on a socialist platform,